Be'ezras Hashem Yisbarech. We are continuing in the Rambam's Minyan Hamitzvot. We are continuing in the Rambam's counting of the 613 mitzvahs. We are currently up to Lo Taaseh Kuf Chav Gimel, negative commandment 123, and we are going to continue as follows. 123 Kuf Chav Gimel. Shelo Haitzi Mibesara Pesach Min Hachabura Shenamar Lo Saitzi Min Habayis. Not to remove any of the meat of the carbon Pesach from the group in which was designated to be eaten, as the pasuk says, do not remove any of the meat from the house. 124 Kuf Chav Daled. Shelo Lases Shirei Menachis Chametz Shenamar Loy Seofe Chametz Chalkam. Not to allow any of the remaining portions of the meal offering to leaven, as the pasuk says, it shall not be baked as a leavened item. 125 Kuf Chav Hey Shelo Le'echol B'sara Pesach Na Umevushal Shenamar Al Toichlu Mimenu Na Uvashel Mivushal. Not to eat any of the meat of the carbon Pesach raw or boiled in water, as the pasuk says, do not eat from it raw or boiled in water. 126 Kuf Chav Vav Shelo Lahachil B'sara Pesach Leger Toishav Shenamar Toishav V'sachir Loy Yoichal Boy. Not to feed any of the meat to a resident alien, as the pasuk says, no temporary resident or hired worker may eat from it. 127 Kuf Chav Zayin Shelo Yoichal Ha'orel B'sara Pesach Shenamar Kol Orel Loy Yoichal Boy. For any uncircumcised man not to eat the meat of the paschal sacrifice, as the pasuk says, no uncircumcised person may eat of it. 128 Kuf Chav Ches Shelo Lahachil B'sara Pesach L'Yisrael Shenishtamed Shenamar Kol Ben Nechar Loy Yoichal Boy. Kloimar Yisrael Shenilva Livnei Nechar V'Avad Avodah Zarah Kimoisam Loy Yoichal Boy. Not to feed any of the meat of the carbon Pesach to a Jew who has converted outside of the faith, as the pasuk says, no outsider may eat from it. This refers to a Jew who has become assimilated among the Gentiles and serves false gods as they do. He must not take part in the carbon Pesach. 129 Kuf Chav Tas Shelo Yoichal Adam Shenitma Kachim Shenamar Va'nefesh Asher Toichal Basar Mizavach Hashlamim V'chulu. And for a person who became ritually impure not to partake in any of the consecrated foods, as the pasuk says, and a soul who partakes of the meat of peace sacrifices when he is impure, etc. 130 Kuf Lamed Shelo Le'echol Min Hakachim Shenitmo Shenamar Va'basar Asher Yigal B'chol Tameh Lo Ye'achel. Not to eat any of the consecrated foods which have become ritually impure, as the pasuk says, meat that has touched any impurity shall not be eaten. 131 Kuf Lamed Aleph Shelo Le'echol Neisar Shenamar V'oichlav Avoinoi Yisa Chulu. Not to eat sacrificial meat that has remained past the time allowed for its consumption, as the pasuk says, one who eats it shall bear his guilt, his soul will be punished, which refers to Kares 132 Kuf Lamed Beis Shelo Le'echol Pigul Shenamar Hamakriv Oisai Loy Yechashev Loy Pigul Yeh Va'nefesh Ha'ichelas Mimenu Avoina Tis'a. Not to eat pigul, which is a different type of disqualification, as the pasuk says, it will not be accepted for him. Instead, it will be considered as pigul. Any person who eats it will bear his guilt. Again, punishable by Kares 133 Kuf Lamed Gimel Shelo Yachol Zar Trumay Shnamar V'chol Zar Lo Yachol Kodesh. For any unauthorized person, he shall not partake in any of the trumais, as the pasuk says, no unauthorized person shall eat it. 134 Kuf Lamed Daled Shelo Yachol Afilu Toishav Koyin. For a tenant or hired worker employed by a priest not to partake in the truma, as the pasuk says, a tenant of a priest or his hired worker shall not eat his holy food. 135 Kuf Lamed Hey Shelo Yoichal Orel Truma V'hu Adin L'Shar Kachim V'Davar Zeh Lamdoi Hakasav Min HaPesach V'Gzeir Shava V'Einoi B'Feirosh Min HaTorah U'Mipi Hashmuel Lamdush Iser Orel B'Kachim V'Gufei Torah V'Einoi B'Divrei Seifrim. Any uncircumcised person may not partake in truma or any of the other consecrated foods. This concept was derived from Gzeir Shava, and it's not explicitly mentioned anywhere in the Torah. But nevertheless, based on the oral tradition, we learned that this prohibition is considered a prohibition of the Torah itself, and not a decree of the Rabbanon. 136 Kuf Lamed Vav Shelo Yoichal Kohen Tamei Truma Shenamar Ish Mizaracha V'chulu Bakadishim Lo Yoichal. For a priest who is impure not to partake in truma, as the pasuk says, any of your descendants shall not eat from the consecrated foods. 137 Kuf Lamed Zayin Shaloi Teichal Chalolo Kodesh Loi Trumais V'Loi Chaze V'Shoik Shenamar Uvas Ki Siya Leish Zar V'Gomer B'Trumas Hakachim Loi Soichel. For a chalala not to partake in consecrated foods, neither truma or the breast and the shank bone, which is also given to the priest, as the pasuk says, when a priest's daughter marries an unauthorized person, she shall not eat from it. 138 Kuf Lamed Ches Shlei Teachel Minchas kohen shenamar v'chol minchas kohen kol te'achel. 4. A meal offering brought by a priest not to be eaten, as the pasuk says, any meal offering brought by a priest shall be consumed entirely by fire, and it shall not be eaten. 139. Kuf lamed tes shloi le'echol b'sar chatos hanasis b'fnim shenamar v'chol chatos asher yuva, not to partake in any of the meat of the sin offering whose blood is sprinkled within the temple sanctuary, as the pasuk says, any sin offering whose blood has been brought, etc. 140. Kuf mem shloi le'echol psulei hamukdashin shehutal bohem mum b'kavana shenamar loy soyachel kol toyeva lamadnu mipi hashmua shebipsulei hamukdashin shehutal bohem mum hakosam medaber, not to partake in any of the consecrated animals that were disqualified because of a blemish that was intentionally afflicted upon them, as the pasuk says, do not eat any abomination. According to the oral tradition, we learned that this is referring to the disqualification for the use because of a blemish inflicted upon the animal. 141. Kuf mem aleph shaloi le'echol ma'aser sheni shel dagon chus liYerushalayim shenamar lo'isuchal le'echol b'sha'arecha, not to eat grain separated as the second tithe outside of the city of Jerusalem, as the pasuk says, you may not eat within your gates. You may not eat within your gates the tithe from your grain. 142. Kuf mem beis shaloi le'echol ma'aser sheni shel tirois chutz liYerushalayim shenamar tirois, not to partake in wine that was separated as the second tithe outside of Jerusalem, as the pasuk continued, your wine. 143. Kuf mem gimel shaloi le'echol ma'aser sheni shel yitar chutz miYerushalayim shenamar v'yitharecha, not to consume oil that was separated as the second tithe outside of Yerushalayim, as the pasuk continues again, and your oil. 144. Kuf mem dalid shaloi le'echol b'char tamim chutz liYerushalayim shenamar lo'isuchal v'chulu u'v'koyros, not to eat an unblemished firstling animal outside of Yerushalayim, as the pasuk says, you may not eat it within your gates, and the firstling of your cattle and your flocks. 145. Kuf mem hey shaloi yoichlu hakoyanim chatos v'asham chutz la'azara shenamar lo'isuchal v'chulu b'karcha v'tzaynecha mipi hashmuel lamdu shaloi ba hakasav elo le'esar psar chatas v'ashamis chutz la'azara lefik shekol davar she'achel chutz limkoim achilosei lo'isuchal le'echol b'sha'arecha ekra bay. For the priests not to eat any of the sin offerings or the guilt offerings outside of the temple courtyard, as the pasuk continues, your cattle and your flocks. And according to the oral tradition, we learned that the purpose of this phrase is only to forbid the consumptions of the sin offerings and the guilt offerings outside of the temple courtyard. Anything that is eaten outside the place intended for it is covered by the prohibition of you may not eat it within your gates. 146. Kuf mem vav shloi le'echol b'sara oila shenamar lo'isuchal v'chulu v'chol nidarecha asher tidar kloimar lo'tuchal le'echol nidarecha asher tidar v'zayhi azhara shel kol ma'el shaloi yehaneh min hakachim ha'asurim lahanes mehem b'imnena ma'al, not to eat the meat of a burnt offering, as the pasuk says, you may not eat the sacrifices that you have vowed to bring, which means to say, you may not eat the sacrifices you have vowed to give. This is a warning against a person benefiting from the use of consecrated articles which he is forbidden to use. If he does derive any benefit from them, he transgresses the prohibition. 147. Kuf mem zayin shaloi le'echol b'sar kachim kalim koydem zrikas adamim shenamar lo'isuchal v'chulu b'nidvaisecha kloimar lo'tuchal le'echol nidvaisecha ad shizarik damam, not to eat the meat of the sacrifices of lesser holiness before the sprinkling of their blood, as the pasuk says, you may not eat the animals you have pledged it to bring as a sacrifice. You are not allowed to eat from the sacrifices until you have pledged, their blood has been sprinkled. 148. Kuf mem ches shelo yochal zar b'sar kachim shenamar v'zar lo yochal ki kodesh heim, for an unauthorized person not to eat the meat of a sacrifice of the highest order, as the pasuk says, an unauthorized person shall not partake of them, for they are holy. 149. Kuf mem tas shelo yochal kohen bikurim koydem hanocha b'azara shenamar lo yisuchal v'gomer userumas yodecha elu habikurim, for a priest not to partake in the first fruits before they are placed down in the temple courtyard, as the pasuk says, you may not eat them, the elevated gifts delivered by hand. That later phrase, the elevated gifts, are referring to the bikurim. 150. Kuf nun shaloi le'echol ma'aser sheni b'tuma v'afilu b'Yerushalayim ad shi podeh shenamar v'loy v'arti mimenu b'tamei, not to eat any foods of the second tithe which have become impure, even within the walls of Jerusalem, until you have redeemed them, as the pasuk says, I have not consumed it while it is impure. 151. Kuf nun aleph shaloi le'echol ma'aser sheni ba'aninos shenamar loy achalti ba'oni mimenu, not to eat the second tithe while in a state of mourning, as the pasuk says, I have not eaten from it while in mourning. 152. Kuf nun beis shaloi lahaitzi dmei ma'aser sheni b'shar dvarim she'ein bohem achila u'shtiya shenamar v'lo nasati mimenu lemeis v'chol shehu chutz l'tzarechei haguf hachai nasati mimenu lemeis ekrabai. Not to use the proceeds from the redemption of the second tithe for anything except for food and drink, as the pasuk says, I have not used it for the dead. Anything that is not associated with the needs of the living body is referred to as used for the dead. 153 Kuf Nun Gimel. Shalilachol tevel vatevel hu adavar shegidulav min haaretz hachayev b'serumais umaises shalilahoitziu mimenu trumas Hashem shenamar v'lo yichalalu es kodshe b'nei Yisrael eis asher yarimu laHashem kloimar dvarim shehein asidin laharim oisam laHashem layasu oisam chol v'yoichlu oisam b'tivlam. Not to eat tevel. The Rambam explained that tevel refers to produce from which one is obligated to separate the truma and the meiseris, from which Hashem's truma has not been separated, as the pasuk says, and they shall not profane the sacred gifts which the children of Israel will separate for Hashem. This implies that the produce which the Jews will ultimately separate for Hashem should not be treated in a mundane manner and eaten while in that state, while being tevel. 154 kuf nun dalit shalei lahakdim truma labi kurim v'lei meiser rishon l'truma v'lei meiser sheni l'rishon ela meitzin ala seder bikurim tchila v'achar kach truma gedela v'achar kach meiser rishon v'achar kach meiser sheni shenemar le'oscha v'dimai cha loy sa'acher kloimar loy sa'acher dover aroi lahak dimai. Not to separate truma before the first fruits, nor the first tithe before the truma, nor the second tithe before the first tithe. Rather, they must be given in an order. First fruits. The first fruits go first, then afterwards you have the truma, then afterwards the first tithe, and then afterwards the second tithe. And this is implied to by the pasuk which says, "Do not delay your offerings of newly ripened produce and your agricultural offerings," which means do not delay bringing an offering that should be brought first. 155 kuf nun hey shlei la'acher hanidarim v'hanidavis shenadar v'shenadav shenamar loy sa'acher. Not to delay in bringing the sacrifices which you vowed to offer, or animals which you pledged to bring as a sacrifice. As the pasuk says, do not delay paying it. 156 kuf nun vav shlei la'alis lacheg v'loy karban shenamar v'loy yera'u panai rei kam. Not to ascend to the festival pilgrimage without bringing a sacrifice, as the pasuk says, do not appear before me empty-handed. 157 kuf nun zayin shlei la'aver al dvarim she'asar odam al nafshe shenamar loy Yachil dvarei. Not to violate a vow which a person makes forbidding the use of anything, as the pasuk says, he shall not violate his word. 158 kuf nun chas shlo yikach koyin zoyna shenamar isha zoyna lo yikachu. For a priest not to marry a immoral woman, as the pasuk says, they shall not marry an immoral woman. 159 kuf nun tes shlo yikach koyin chalala shenamar v'chalala lo yikachu. For a priest not to marry a chalala, as the pasuk says, they shall not marry a chalala. 160 kuf samech shlo yikach koyin grusha shenamar v'isha grusha me'isha lo yikachu. For a priest not to marry a divorcee, as the pasuk says, nor they may marry a woman divorced from her husband. 161 kuf samech aleph shlo yikach koyin gadol almana shenamar almana ugrusha v'chalala zoyna v'gomer. For a high priest not to marry a widow, as the pasuk says, a widow, a divorcee, or a chalala, or an immoral woman, he must not marry. 162 kuf samach beis shelo yivol kohen gadol almana va'afilu b'lei kedushim mipnei shemachalala v'nemar v'lo yichalel zarei ba'amav harehu muzar shelo yichalel ksheira. For a high priest not to have even sexual relations with a widow, even outside of the context of marriage, because by doing so he profanes her, as the pasuk says, he shall not profane his position. This also implies that he must not cause a woman eligible to marry a priest to become ineligible, which happens through the relations described above. 163 kuf samech gimel shlo yikones koyin la mikdash perua roish shenamar rosheichem al tifro. For a priest not to enter the temple with his hair that grew long, as the pasuk says, do not let your hair grow long. 164 shlo yikones koyin la mikdash krua b'gadim shenamar uvigdeichem loy sifarmu. For a priest not to enter the temple with torn garments, as the pasuk says, do not rend your garments. 165 kuf samechei shelo yetze hakoyin min azara b'shas avoda shenamar umi pesach oil moed lo yisetzu pen tom musu. For a priest not to leave the temple courtyard when he's in the middle of his service, as the pasuk says, do not depart from before the entrance of the test of testimony. 166 kuf samech vav shelo yitame koyin hedyet b'shar mesim shenamar lenefesh lo yitama ba'amav. For a common priest not to become impure through his contact with a corpse, As the pasuk says, he shall not become impure through contact with the dead. 167 kuf samach zayin shaloi yitame kohen gadol va'afilu lekroivin shenamar la'aviv u'limai lo yitama. For a high priest not to become impure through the context of a corpse, the contact with a corpse, even for his close relatives, as the pasuk says, he shall not become impure even for his father and his mother. 168 kuf samachas shaloi yikanes kohen gadol imes shenamar va'alkol nafshes meis lo yavei kach lamdu mipiashmua shehu chayev b'chol yavei v'chayev beval yitamei. For a high priest not to enter a place where a corpse is found, as the pasuk says, he shall not come in contact with any dead body. And according to the oral tradition, we learned that he's going to be obligated for violating both of the prohibitions, 167 and 168, not to become impure and not to enter the place of a corpse. 169 kuf samech tes shlayikach kol shevet levi chelik ba'aretz shenamar v'nachala la'yalai. For the tribe of Levi not to partake in a portion of Eretz Yisrael, as the pasuk says, he shall not receive any inheritance. 170 kuf ayin shlayikach kol shevet levi chelik ba'biza b'shas kibush ha'aretz shenamar la'yia la'koyanim v'gomer. For the tribe of Levi not to partake in any of the spoils of any of the conquests of Eretz Yisrael, as the pasuk says, the priests and the Levites shall not receive a portion of the inheritance. 171 kuf ayin aleph shaloi lases karcha al meis shenamar v'loi sasimu parecha bein einechem lameis. Not to tear out his hair in mourning for the dead, as the pasuk says, do not make a bald spot upon your head. 172 kuf ayin beis shaloi la'echo behema tmeya shenamar ach es ze loy soichlu mima'alei hagera. Not to eat non-kosher animals, as the pasuk says, nevertheless, among those who chew the cud, these you may not eat. 173 kuf ayin gimel shaloi la'echo dog tamish shenamar v'sheket yulachem mibisaram loy soichelu. Not to eat non-kosher fish, as the pasuk says, they shall be regarded as a disgusting thing for you. Do not eat any of their flesh. 174 kuf ayin daled shaloi la'echo oif tamish shenamar v'es eila teshatku min ha'oif lo ye'achlu. Not to eat any non-kosher birds, as the pasuk says, do not eat them. 175 kuf ayin hey shaloi la'echo sheretz ha'oif shenamar kol sheretz ha'oif tameh hu lachem. Not to eat any of the flying insects, the creepy crawlies that fly. As the pasuk says, every flying insect that is not kosher shall not be eaten. 176 kuf ayin vav shaloi la'echo sheretz ha'aretz shenamar v'chol ha'sheretz ha'sheretz ala aretz sheketz hu. Not to eat any insects that breed on the land, as the pasuk says, every insect that creeps upon the earth must be regarded as disgusting. It may not be eaten. 177 kuf ayin zayin shaloi la'echo remes ha'aretz shenamar v'loi sitam u es nafshei seichem. Not to eat any of the creepy, crawly things that creep on the earth, as the pasuk says, do not make your souls impure with any insects that creep on the earth. 178 kuf ayin ches shaloi la'echo teilas haperes ki shetese la'avir shenamar l'chol hasheretz hasheretz al aretz v'gomer. Not to eat worms that breed or produce after they become exposed to the air, as the pasuk says, for any swarming creature which breeds upon the land, you shall not eat them. 179 kuf ayin tesh shaloi la'echo sheretz amayim shenamar al teshaksu es nafshei seichem b'chol hasheretz v'gomer. Not to eat swarming creatures that breed in the water, as the pasuk says, do not make yourself sustainable by eating any of these swarming creatures. 180 kuf pei shaloi la'echol mesa shenamar loy soichlu kol nevela. Not to eat any carcasses, as the pasuk says, do not eat any carcasses. 181 shaloi la'echol trefa shenamar uvasar basada terfa loy soichelu. Not to eat any animals with any mortal inflictions, as the pasuk says, do not eat any flesh torn off by a predator. 182 kuf pei beis shaloi la'echol eva min achai shenamar loy seichal anafesh im habasar. Not to eat any meat that is connected to a living animal, as the pasuk says, do not eat the life of an animal with its flesh. 183 kuf pei gimel shaloi la'echol gid hanasha shenamar loy yoichlu b'nei Yisrael as gid hanasha. Not to eat the sciatic nerve, as the pasuk says, the children of Israel do not eat the nerve. 184 kuf pei dalet shaloi la'echol dam shenamar v'chol dam loy soichlu b'chol moshe seichem. Not to eat blood, as the pasuk says, do not consume any blood. 185 kuf pei hey shaloi la'echol chelev shenamar kol chelev shor v'keves va'ez loy soichelu. Not to eat the forbidden fats, as the pasuk says, do not eat any of the fat in the ox, sheep, or the goat. 186 kuf pei vav shaloi levashel basar b'cholav shenamar loy sevashel gedi b'chalev imay. Not to cook any milk and meat together, as the pasuk says, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. 188 kuf pei ches shaloi la'echol b'sar shor haniskol shenamar v'le'yochel es b'sarei. Not to eat the meat of an ox that was stoned to death, as the pasuk says, and do not eat its flesh. 189 kuf pei tes shaloi la'echol pas tvua chadasha koydem ha'pasach shenamar v'lechem v'koli v'charmel loy soichlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. Not to eat bread made from the newly grown produce before Pesach, as the pasuk says, until that day you may not eat bread. 190 kuf tzadik shaloi la'echol Kali min achadash. Shenamar v'kali loy soichlu ad etzem. Not to eat roasted grain from this new grown produce before Pesach, as the pasuk says. Until that day, you may not eat roasted grain. 191 Kuf Tzadik Aleph Shaloi La'echol Carmel Mitvua Chadasha Shenamar v'Charmel loy soichlu. Not to eat fresh grain from the newly grown produce until Pesach, as the pasuk says. You may not eat fresh grain. 192 Kuf Tzadik Beis. Shaloi la'echol arla, shenamar shaloi shanim yelachem arelim lo yeachel. Not to eat arla for 3 years, as the pasuk says. For 3 years, you must regard its fruit as forbidden growth. It may not be eaten. 193. Kuf tzadik gimel. Shaloi la'echol kilei hakerem. Shenamar pen tikdash hamlea hazera asher tizra usivuas hakarem. Zehu isra achila. Not to eat mixed species planted in a vineyard, as the pasuk says, lest the yield of the crops you planted and the fruit of the vineyard shall become forfeit. This refers to the prohibition against eating this type of produce. 194 Kuf Tzadik Dalet Shaloi Lishtes Yain Nasach Shenamar Asher Chelev Ziva Chemoy Yeach Lu Yishtu Yain Nisacham. Not to drink wine which was used for idolatrous libations, as the pasuk says, who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their libations. 195 Kuf Tzadik Hey Shloi La'echol V'lishtais Derech Zoilo V'soive Shenamar Benenu Zeh V'chulu Zoilo V'soive. Not to eat or drink like a glutton or a drunkard, as the pasuk says, this son of ours is a glutton and a drunkard. 196 Kuf Tzadik Vav Shloi La'echol B'yem Atzoyim Shenamar Ki Chol HaNefesh Asher Lois Una V'avati not to eat on the day of the fast of Yom Kippur, as the pasuk says, for any person who does not afflict himself on that day. 197 Kuf Tzadik Zayin. Shaloi la'echol chametz b'Pesach shenamar lo ye'ochel chametz. Not to eat chametz on Pesach, as the pasuk says, do not eat chametz. 198 Kuf Tzadik Chas. Shaloi la'echol ta'areves chametz shenamar kol mach metzes loy soichelu. Not to eat any mixture of chametz, as the pasuk says, do not eat any leavened matter. 199 Kuf Tzadik Tash. Shaloi la'echol chametz achar chatzos yom arba'as shenamar loy soichal olav chametz. Not to eat chametz after noon on the 14th of Nisan, because the pasuk says, do not eat chametz with it. Number 200 Reish. Shaloi yira'eh chametz shenamar v'lo yira'eh l'chol chametz. Not to even see chametz in one's possessions, as the pasuk says, no chametz and no leavened bread may be seen in your territories. 201 Reish Aleph. Shaloi yimatzeh chametz shenamar se'or lo yimatzeh b'vatechem. Not to have to find chametz in your possession, as the pasuk says, no chametz may be found in your homes. 202 Reish Beis. Shaloi yishteh hanazir yayin v'lo davar shenis arev ba yayin v'ta'amoy Ketam yayin shenamar v'chol mishras anavim v'afilu hachametz hayayin oy davar shenis arev boy hayayin arezeh aser alav shenamar chametz yayin v'chametz shechar lo yishteh. A nazir is not able to drink wine or particularly anything that has wine mixed in with it, that has the taste of wine. As the pasuk says, he shall not drink any grape beverage. This prohibition applies even if the wine or other beverage which the wine was mixed has become sour. The above verse states that he may not drink vinegar from the wine or from wine brandy. 203 Reish Gimel Shlo Ya'achel Anovim Lachim Shenamar Va'anovim Lachim Lo Yechel. For a nazir not to eat any fresh grapes, as the pasuk says, he shall not eat any fresh grapes. 204 Reish Dalad Shlo Yechel Anovim Yeveshim Shenamar Yeveshim Lo Yechel. For a nazir not to eat any dry grapes, as the pasuk says, he shall not eat any dry grapes. 205 Reish Hey Shlo Yechel Chartzanim Shenamar Nechartzanim V'chulu Lo Yechel. He can't eat any grape seeds, as the pasuk says, he shall not eat anything from grapes or from its seeds. 206 Reish Vav Shelo Yachel Zugim Shenamar V'adzog Lo Yachel. He can't eat any grape peels, as the pasuk says, he shall not eat anything from the wine, even its peels. 207 Reish Zayin Shelo Yitame Hanazir Lameis Shenamar La'aviv L'imay V'chulu Lo Yitama Lahem B'Moisam. That a nazir shall not become impure through the contact with any dead body, as the pasuk says, he may not become impure even for his father and mother. 208 Reish Chash Shelo Yikanis B'Alameis Shenamar Al Nefesh Meis Lo Yova. He can't enter a roof in which a corpse is below, as the pasuk says, he shall not come in contact with any body, any dead body. 209 Reish Tash Lo Yigaleach Hanazir Shenamar Tar Lo Ya'aver Al Roshe. He cannot shave, as the pasuk says, a razor shall not pass upon his head. 210 Reish Yod Shaloi Liksar Kol Hasadeh Shenamar Lo Sichale Pas Sadecha Bekutz Recha. He cannot, the prohibition for one to harvest one's entire field, as the pasuk says, do not completely harvest the ends of your field. 211 Reish Yod Aleph Shaloi Liktoit Hashibalim Hanoiflois B'Shas Ktsira Shenamar V'Leket Ktsircha Loi Selakit. For one to gather up all the stalks that fall in the harvest and not to leave any behind, as the pasuk says, do not gather the leket of your harvest. 212 Reish Yud Beis Shaloi Libtzar Oilois Hakerem Shenamar V'Karmecha Loi Sa'oilo. Not to harvest the undeveloped grape clusters, as the pasuk says, do not pick the incomplete formed grape clusters in your vineyard. 213 Reish Yud Gimel Shaloi Liktoit Peret hakerem shenamar uperet karmecha loy selakit. For one, not to gather individual fallen grapes. As the pasuk says, do not gather the individual fallen grapes in your vineyard. 214 ratio dalit shaloi likach omer hashicha shenamar loy sashuv lekachtoi v'chein l'chol ilonis yesh shicha shenamar loy sefaer acharecha. Not to take a sheaf which has been forgotten. As the pasuk says, do not go back and take it. This prohibition, the Rambam explains, also applies to trees. As the pasuk says, do not carefully reharvest it. 215 reish tes vav loy lizraya kile zeraim shenamar sotcha leisizra kloim. Not to sow any mixed species of seeds together. As the pasuk says, do not sow different species of your seeds of your field. 216 reish tes zayin shaloi lizraya tvua a yarak bekarem shenamar leisizra karmecha kloim. Not to sow any grain or vegetable in a vineyard, as the pasuk says, do not plant different species in your vineyard. 217 ratio zayin shaloi laharbia behema min im she'enoi minoi shenamar behem techa loy sarbia kiloim. Not to crossbreed different types of animals, as the pasuk says, do not crossbreed your livestock with other species. 218 ratio tchash loy asa malacha b'shnei mine behema ke'echad shenamar loy secharish v'shar uv'chamor yachtav. Not to plow with two different animals together, as the pasuk says, do not plow with an ox and a donkey together. 219 ratio test shaloi lachasoim behema b'shas malacha b'davar sharichelas mimenu v'nenes shenamar loy sachsoim shar b'dishay. Not to muzzle an ox while it's working with produce from which it would eat and derive benefit, as the pasuk says, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading on grain. 220 reish chaf shaloi la'aved adama b'shvius shenemar sadecha leisizra. Not to do work on your field in the Shemitah year, as it says, do not sow your field. Reish chaf aleph 221 shaloi la'aved ilon b'shvius shenemar v'char mechol leisizra. Not to cultivate trees in the 7th year, as it says, do not prune your vineyard. 222 shaloi liktzar sifchei shvius kederech shekaitzrin b'sha'ar hashanim shenemar eis sefiach kitzircha loy siktzar. Not to reap crops that grow on their own in the 7th year, as in the same manner that they would in an ordinary year. As the pasuk says, do not reap the crops of your harvest that grow on their own. 223 reish chaf gimel shaloi la'asoif perus ha'ilam b'shvius kederech sheisav b'chol hashana shenamar v'es inve nizirecha loy siptzar. Not to reap the fruit that grows on trees in the 7th year in the same manner that they would in an ordinary year, as the pasuk says, and do not gather the grapes of your vines, for which you must abstain. 224 reish chaf dalet shaloi la'avid b'shnas yovel bein adama bein ilon shenamar loy sizra'u. Not to do any agricultural work on land or on trees in the 50th year, the yovel year, the jubilee year, as it says, do not sow. 225 reish chav hey shaloi liktzar sifchei yovel kishar hashanim shenamar boy loy siktzuru es sificheha. Not to reap crops that grow on their own in the yovel year, as the pasuk says, do not harvest the crops which grow on their own. 226 reish chav vav shel la'asoif perus yovel ka'asifas shar hashanim shenamar boy loy siftzeru es nizireha. Not to reap the fruit of the yovel year in the same manner on an ordinary year, as the pasuk says, and do not gather the grapes of your vines, for which you must abstain. 227 reish chav zayin shaloi limkar sad b'eretz Yisrael litzim misus shenamar va'aretz leisim macher litzim misus. Not to sell a field in Eretz Yisrael in perpetuity, as the pasuk says, do not make a permanent sale of the land. 228 reish chav ches shaloi leshanes migirshe alavim usidei sehem shenamar usidei migrash arehem lo yimacher mipi hashmo lamdu shezoi azhara shelo yishtane. Not to change the purpose of the open areas in the fields which were given to the Levium, as the pasuk says, the fields of the open areas surrounding their cities shall not be sold. According to the oral tradition, we learned that this verse is a prohibition against changing the purpose which these lands were meant to be used. 229 reish chaf tas shalei la'azev halavim shenamar hishamer lecha pen ta'azev es alevi elo noisim lahem atay noisehem. Not to forsake the Levium, as it says, be careful not to abandon the Levi, rather to give them gifts and to rejoice with them on each of the festivals. 230 reish lamed shaloi yispa halva'a she'avra aleh shvius shenamar la yigash es re'eu v'es achiv. Not to demand the repayment of a loan after the 7th year, as the pasuk says, do not demand payment from your fellow man. 231 reish lamed aleph shaloi imana Milahalvois laani mipi hashmita shenamar hishamer lecha pen yeh adavar v'chulu zakla kol makim shenamar hishamer ay pen ay al eina ela mitzvahs Lo Taaseh. Not to withhold lending money to a poor person because of the advent of a Shemitah year, as the pasuk says, be careful lest an idea occur to you. This is an accepted general principle. The Rambam is now giving us another general principle, that whenever the Torah uses the expression be careful lest or do not, it is concerning a negative commandment. 232 reish lamed beis shaloi lihimona. Not to Umelitain loy mashu tzarich shenamar loy sa'amitz es levavcha v'chulu nimtza hanois in tzedakah isa mitzasasei v'hama ilim einov min hatzedakah yeser al shabitel asei avar al leisasei. Not to withhold money from a poor person or providing him with his needs. As the pasuk says, do not harden your heart. Thus, what we see from here is that a person who gives tzedakah, he fulfills a positive commandment. But one who doesn't give tzedakah, not only does he fail to perform a positive commandment, but he also gets this negative commandment. 233. Reish Lamed Gimel Shaloi L'Shaleach Eved Ivri Rekam K'Shiyetze Chavshi Shenamar Loi Tzishalchenu Rekam. Not to send away a Hebrew slave empty-handed when he goes free, as the pasuk says, do not send him away empty-handed. 234. Reish Lamed Dalid Shaloi Yizba Ha'ani B'Chayvai K'Shiyeda Shu Ani V'La Yoitzer Loi Shenamar Loi Siya Loi Kinoi She. Not to demand payment of a debt from a poor person when one knows that he's impoverished, nor cause him grief. As the pasuk says, do not behave like a creditor towards him. 235. Reish Lamed Hey Shaloi Lahal Voice Beribis L'Yisrael Shenamar Es Kas B'Cha Loi Sitein Loi B'Neshech U Uvimarbis. Not to lend with interest to a Jew, as the pasuk says, do not lend him your money at interest. 236. Reish Lamed Vav Shlei Lubois Beribis Shenamar Loi Sash Shich Lo Achicha. Not to lend with interest, as it says, do not take interest from your brother. And and this we learned from the oral tradition as a verse that is interpreted as a prohibition forbidding a borrower from paying interest to a lender. 237. Reish Lamed Zayin Shaloi Lahashis Yod Bein Leiva Umalve Beribis Shaloi Beribis Loi Liais Orev V'Loi Eid V'Loi Lichtov Shtar B'Neim Shnamar Loi Sisimun Olav Nashach. Not to intermediate between a borrower and a lender when interest is involved, not to act as a guarantor or a witness, nor to draw up a contract, etc. As the pasuk says, do not charge him interest. 238. Reish Lamed Ches Shaloi La'acher Pu'ulas Sachir Shenamar Loi Solin Pu'ulas Sachir V'Gomer. Not to delay the payment of a worker. As the pasuk says, do not hold back a worker's wage overnight. 239. Reish Lamed Tes Shaloi Yimash Kain Bal Chayv Bizraya Shenamar Loi Savai El Beisai La'avit Avotai. Not to take a security from a debtor by force. As the pasuk says, do not enter his home and take a security. 240. Reish Mem Shaloi Limnoya Ha'avit Mibalav Ani Be'eshu Tzarich Loi Shenamar Loi Sishkav Ba'avotai Kloimar Loi Sishkav Ba'avotai Im Cha Ella Tishivenu Loi Balayla Hoyo V'Hu Tzarich Loi Balayla. Not to withhold the return of a security to its owner when he needs it. As the pasuk says, do not lie down to sleep with the security, i.e., don't lie down while holding a security. Instead, return it to him at night when he needs it. 241. Reish Mem Aleph Shaloi Lemashkin Ha'al Mana Shnamar V'Loi Sachavoil Beged Al Mana. Not to take security from a widow, as it says, do not take the widow's garment as a security. 242. Reish Mem Beis Shaloi Lachavoil Kalim Shoisin Bohen Eichel Nefesh Shnamar Lo Yechavoil Reichem. Not to take any utensils which are used for the preparation of food as a security, as the pasuk says, do not take either the upper or the lower milestone as a pledge. 243. Reish Mem Gimel Shaloi Lignev Nefesh Mishral Shenamar Leisignev Zeg Goinev Nefesh. Not to kidnap, as the pasuk says, do not steal. This refers to kidnapping. Reish Mem Dalid. 244. Shaloi Lignev Mammon Shenamar Loi Signevu Zayhi Gnevas Mammon. Not to steal any money, as the pasuk says, do not steal. This is referring to stealing money, and we are going to stop here for today and continue with the Lo Taaseh tomorrow.